Good afternoon. This is Debbie Thompson, and I'm President of Strategy Solutions. And I'd like to welcome you to the program, Strategic Marketing for Women Religious, Marketing Your Charism. And this is a Cliff Notes version of a keynote address and workshop that I did for the NCNWR conference last month. And I'm reprising that presentation for people who would want to come and listen to the presentation again, maybe with some others from their congregation or organization that wasn't able to attend the session in Baltimore. And I'm also recording it for the purpose of those folks who would like to have someone from their leadership or from their congregation listen to the message without having to attend the webinar or not having attended the conference itself. So this session is really to talk a little bit about that M word that people are uncomfortable with, and many people are uncomfortable with in religious orders. And as I get started on this presentation, I wanted to say special thanks to the individuals that are listed on this page who have had a great deal of influence in my thinking about this topic and how to apply it to the plight of the communications professionals who work for and attempt to support religious communities. And I told this story when I did this session that it's interesting that, especially my thanks to Lisa Olson from the Presentation Sisters in South Dakota, I actually did a project for the Presentation Sisters after the last time I spoke at the NCNWR conference, which was back in 2003 in Pittsburgh, if any of you have been with the organization quite some time. And that process taught me a lot about the concept of charism and what it really meant to follow a calling. And I had the good fortune during that process of really learning what the process of discernment was for folks. The long and the short of it was that once I realized the concept of charism, I realized that I myself was a product of the Sisters of St. Joseph in Northwest Pennsylvania, and the charism of the sisters of unity of neighbor and neighbor with God and love of neighbor without distinction was very much who I was and how I lived my life. And I actually became an associate of the Sisters of St. Joseph in Northwest Pennsylvania as a result of that calling. And I also wanted to thank the other members of the committee and others who helped me by preparing some of the material for this presentation. For those of you who don't know Strategy Solutions very well, my company it's a private company, but it was started out of my personal mission and my desire to really want to help create healthy communities. And I'm a recovering hospital planner. Please don't hold it against me. But I worked for 10 years for a healthcare system and was I call the spiritual leader of the community health movement, and got involved in a lot of projects and efforts to try to create a healthier community. But I recognized after working for a healthcare system for 10 years that healthcare systems weren't going to solve the community health equation, that it was really about creating wealth in communities and supporting private sector wealth creators, but also making sure that the public sector, which included government and workforce and economic development, tied in with those and supported those private sector wealth creating companies. But also important to healthy communities was the social service sector, which included community and faith-based nonprofits, as well as healthcare organizations that help support people, because it was the people that became the workforce of companies. And I also recognize that if you really want to help improve someone's quality of life, you want to get them a better job, and it's going to make a lot of difference. And for those of you who are sisters who are working in social justice ministries or anti-poverty ministries, you understand that equation very well. The other thing we do at Strategy Solutions is really help to support healthy organizations. And those organizations are created at the intersection of strong operations, strong finance, and strong support services. And all of them have to work together. And in recent years, I've been talking a lot about creating a sustainable business model in an organization. And the price of sustainability for any organization today is to generate enough cash to be able to innovate at the rate of change of the marketplace, or ideally ahead of it. And the example that I use a lot is the example of a smartphone or an iPhone. Most of us today have some type of technology that we carry around. And I finally joined Team iPhone, which is what my 17-year-old daughter calls it. After years of carrying around a phone that didn't work very well, I finally buckled into the pressure and got an iPhone. But the Apple company has created about 5 generations of iPhones in 24 months. And many of our companies and organizations are continuing to do the same thing that we've always done in the same way, and wondering why it's hard to sell, or people don't buy it, or we don't have as many people in our world as we think we ought to. And the purpose of this presentation is really to help to think about and to stimulate some thinking around what is it that we really offer as a religious community. What is the product? And I know many people have difficulty with using business language as applied to ministry or congregations, but I really do think that it's important to recognize that our goal should be to outline methods to diagnose where and how you might be stuck in your strategic communications process, and to provide some tools and strategies to help you move forward. And as I thought about that in preparation for the NCNWR conference, and my bent, because I'm a frustrated university professor at heart, I can talk about the theory of marketing and product market positioning, but more importantly, for purposes of this presentation, what I wanted to be able to do is give you some tools to be able to diagnose and to think about where your organization and where your community might be stuck, and to give you a new language and some tools to help you get past those stuck parts. So I left, in this presentation, I actually left the demographics and the answers to the questions that the group was able to answer during the course of the presentation. So of the 114 people that were in the room that day when I did the presentation, about 60% of them were communications and marketing professionals. Most of them were, about 20% of them were communications plus either fundraising or vocations, and we had some folks that did some other things. But I left that information in there so that you folks that are here on the phone today can get a sense of how people were feeling as I posed some of these questions if we think about NCNWR as a full group. I also tied back the things that were in this presentation to Dr. Simone Campbell and some of the things that she spoke about the first day of the conference, because the comments that she made about thinking about the mission and the gift given of the congregations to the broader community. That language of gift given was the same language that I wanted to talk about related to product, that the product that an organization gives or the services an organization gives is the gift to the community. And Sister Simone was talking about the fact that there is a deep hunger in today's world for spirituality and for community, and to know that we're not alone as individual people. But yet, we don't have the same kinds of, I call them captive audiences, that we used to have years ago that allowed individuals to have relationships with the sisters in the way I had, for example, growing up. I'm a product of many congregations, even though I talk about the fact that I became an associate of the Sisters of St. Joseph, because they shaped, that what I learned through Villa Maria College shaped who I am as an adult. but I actually am the product of Sisters of the Divine Providence, Vincentian, Dominicans as well, and I still teach at Duquesne University. So I've had lots of Catholic school upbringing and lots of influence of different congregations, but I was a captive audience that when I went to Catholic school that I could interface with the sisters. Those captive audiences don't exist today the way they used to. I also wanted to tie back the luncheon speaker the first day of the conference who talked about the fact that the Conrad Hilton Foundation will support different capacities, 3 different capacities related to membership, leadership, and resources to help the ongoing vitality of congregations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about capacity building in a slightly different way in the course of this presentation. One of my key messages for all of the groups that I've been speaking to in the last year or so is that a critical success factor for sustainability today is that we must challenge our assumptions about what we believe we think we know, because the rules that we lived by 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they don't work anymore in today's environment. They just don't. So we have to challenge our assumptions about the way we used to do things. And communications professionals that work with congregations support many things. They support community awareness. They support spiritual engagement, experiences and programs. They support vocations, ministry fundraising, congregational fundraising. There's a variety of different things that communications professionals do. And these same professionals have a number of challenges. These were the things that I heard from the folks that were on my list at the beginning of the presentation, my gratitude list. These were the folks that I interviewed in preparation for this presentation. Communicators today face a number of different challenges: sustainability in an environment of diminishment, strategic connection with leadership, and strategic thinking and planning. And in many cases, the communications professional is also the acting planning facilitator to try to keep the leadership focus and the thinking of leadership and connect it to what's being communicated operationally. The communicators are also challenged with articulating the charism in a meaningful way that attracts the right people, supporters, donors, and sisters. Leveraging and utilizing technology, which is very big for a lot of people, and the shift to using social media as opposed to captive audiences where people are connected to each other one-on-one. Evaluating the return on investment of marketing strategies and measuring the impact of the sisters in their ministries. I had one person tell me that their community recognizes that the community probably wouldn't exist without the role of the sisters and the work that they have done strategically in that community over the years. Now that community recognizes it and ties that back to the sisters, but there is so much impact that the sisters in their ministries do that people in the broader community really don't appreciate to the level that they could or should. And the communicators challenged me with, help us identify strategies to overcome our challenges. So the first thing that I did was take a look at the places where a congregation might be stuck. And there's a handout that goes along with this presentation that if you don't have it, I will have Kathy send it to you after this presentation, which is a assessment form that I put together to help congregations really look at where are we. Because the plight of the communications professional is a diverse one. Some people have certain challenges, other people have different challenges, but it's typically one of these bullet points on this page, which is where people might be stuck. It could be visioning and strategic thinking. We don't have enough of that going on. Or what I will call product development planning. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Communicator involvement in strategic thinking and planning could also be a problem. The sisters who are in leadership are in fact planning. They have a plan either written down or on paper, but especially if the communicator is a layperson, there isn't always that close link of communicator involvement directly in the strategic thinking and planning. Implementation of strategic initiatives could be a challenge. I had one person tell me, well, we do lots of visioning and planning, we just don't connect it well to implementation. Some folks are having difficulty actually branding the charism or coming up with those strategic words that really describe what it is that the charism means. There's also a number of operational places where they could be stuck, which include identifying strategically communicating with particular target audiences, listening to the voice of the customer and tailoring communications accordingly, leveraging technology to reach new audiences, strategically marketing and engaging the target audiences in activities, programs, and events, community outreach or outcomes and impact evaluation. And it's difficult for the communicator to be operationally successful if there is a strategic gap. It's also hard for a communicator to be operationally successful if they don't have the technical skills in one or more of those other areas. But it helps to know where your gap is, because if you could figure out which gap you're dealing with, you can address that gap and not just sit around and say, oh, woe is me, I don't have any resources, so I can't do anything. So I'm forced to be in a situation where I'm managing decline. So I asked people in the audience, which of the following best describes your congregation? Now you can tell here that more than half of the audience really saw themselves as either on the fence or focusing on the future. About 43% of the audience that was in attendance that day said that they were, focusing on the future and trying to identify new ways of living and experiencing the charism. And there are a few folks, though, that said that they were in the position where they were managing diminishment, which is, they were just focusing on managing the decline of their organization. I also asked folks, to what degree that they were actively utilizing technology. And most folks were, again, actively utilizing technology and making great strides in it. Some folks were struggling. I also asked folks how effective they felt their marketing and communications strategies have been over the past few years. And the majority of them said that they've been somewhat effective, but there's been room for improvement. And of course, I asked those folks who said they've been extremely effective if they wanted to come up and finish doing the presentation for me, because there are probably a few folks in the room who have this all figured out. But for the most part, most folks felt like they were struggling with one thing or another. What I attempted to do through the rest of the presentation and through that handout, which is actually an assessment tool, was to try to give people a tool to assess where are they and how might they be able to intervene on it. So what are some of the effective communication strategies I heard from those folks who felt they were doing things that were cool or interesting? One of them was strategic storytelling about the sisters and the impact of their ministries. Engaging the sisters in telling the story of their spirituality and how it's embodied in their ministry. Designing publications for the target audiences, not just members, things that had stories that people would pass on. Selling mass and prayer cards was a way of not only engaging people but also doing fundraising. Embracing technology and social media. This example was something that somebody shared with me that said, this is the simplest thing in the world, but you can't imagine how much it has increased visibility for the sisters in the community by just asking them to wear name tags out in the community. Once upon a time, most religious orders, if not all religious orders, were seen by the habit that the sisters wore. A lot of sisters don't wear them anymore, so you don't know where they belong. and then capitalizing on the impact that sisters made in people's lives and allowing people who had impactful stories of the sisters, either when they were young or in school or whatever. Those were all good, effective strategies for how to increase communications. Now, I want to talk about marketing and saying that a rose by any other name is still a rose. And while some of you might cringe at the word marketing, I really do think it represents what religious communities do at their best. And I challenge you to think about the definitions that I am about to talk about and that I've recorded as part of this presentation to encourage you to become a little bit more comfortable with what you may be uncomfortable with. So I asked folks in the audience that day what their level of comfort was with marketing terminology. And while most folks said they were at least somewhat comfortable, we had about, 23% of the folks in the room said that they're not very comfortable with the marketing terminology. And I spent some time now encouraging you to think about new things. First of all, why are we uncomfortable with marketing? One of my colleague friends said that the day she was a lay person who was hired by the sisters, and she was talking about her job as a communications professional, and somebody said to her, "What's your new job? You write jingles for nuns?" Thinking that that was what it was about. And as I talked to people at the session, people have negative connotations with the idea of marketing because they equate it to sales. Because if I talk about marketing, I might talk about selling something. I'm uncomfortable with this idea of selling. However, I want you to think about this, that marketing ourselves and our organizations doesn't have to be a hard sell, nor does it have to be manipulative or pushy or offensive. In fact, good marketing is actually the opposite. And marketing is, at its essence, is the successful exchange relationships that attract perfect customers. And good marketing doesn't sell things and it doesn't push things on people that they don't want to buy. It actually asks the questions, who are our customers and what are their needs, and designs products and services to meet those needs. Good marketing is also the appropriate mix of product, price, place, and promotion strategies. And I would submit to you, even if you don't believe it, what religious communities have evolved to are actually a pretty good example of the marketing mix, or at least used to be. Okay? So here's the historical marketing mix. Years ago, sisters had captive audiences of millions of students because they taught in schools, worked in hospitals, and were active in churches. Especially if we were Catholic, and even if we weren't Catholic, we had an opportunity to, depending on what the ministries were of the sisters, we as people had opportunities to interface with them. Young women who were inspired by their spirituality and way of life were attracted to do the same. The sisters lived the 4 Ps of the marketing mix without any awareness that they were doing it. The product, or the gift of the sisters, is a compelling career choice to follow God's calling into ministry. That's the ultimate product. There are other products that the religious communities offer, not just vowed ministry. There's also different options today, such as being an associate, getting involved in one of the actual social justice or other community service ministries. Those are all the products, the retreats and spiritual development programs or the spiritual direction services that sisters offer are all products of the congregation. The price, the historical price, was the commitment to the community. The place, captive audiences, where sisters worked. That's where they distributed their services and in their ministries. And their promotion, they didn't have to advertise. Sisters didn't have to communicate. Their promotion was done with direct interactions and communications with the sisters. I knew what the sisters did because I watched their lived experience. And the sisters were able to speak Christ, but use words when necessary, thus offering the ability to strengthen relationship with God and with the congregation through experiential learning. And that's especially important for people who need something. Most of us don't learn by conceptual theoretical learning. Most of us learn by some type of experience. So having interactions with the sisters was an important way of experiencing learning. Now, the challenge to that, especially with the way that the demographics of the congregations have been in recent years, the challenge becomes sustainability. And the world has changed. And the question I think that each congregation needs to ask themselves is, are we appropriately adapting to the changes in the world? And I show this slide. I mentioned earlier that I'm a recovering hospital planner. I'm also a frustrated university professor at heart. I teach in the Masters of Organizational Leadership program at Duquesne University. And this, what you have in front of you, is a life cycle curve. And it could be any life cycle curve. We as people, we're born, we grow, we die. And our life cycles, they have a tendency to grow, and then they hit that limit, that top of that curve where I have that new little curve called transformation. When an organization or a product reaches the limits of how much it's able to grow, it either has to transform, like Apple created versions 2, 3, 4, and 5, and I think now 5S of the iPhone. We have to figure out how to transform that product or that offering or that gift that we're giving, transform it into a new model. And the question for our congregations today is, how do we operationalize our vision, our calling? Where do we feel God is calling us into programs and services, or into gifts and relationships in community, however you define it for you? And that's an important question. And it's also important for every established organization to have what I call an operational definition of its vision and strategic direction, so that the communications professional knows that based on where we think our congregation is going, we're being called to whatever the answer to that question is. You should have that strategically translated into some type of programs and services and engagement experiences, whether that's through ministry, through teaching, through spiritual direction, however you choose to define it. If you don't have an operational definition of how that translates, it's going to be a challenge for your communications professionals to communicate it. And even if an organization does successfully engage in visioning, if it doesn't implement its strategies, it will remain stuck. And the role of the leadership, and this is an important comment to make, and I heard Sister Simone say this the day before my presentation. The role of leadership is not to protect their institution. It's to sustain their mission. And she was talking about that in the context of, how the heads of the Catholic Church, instead of doing the right thing in some of the scandals of recent years, tried to protect the institution when they really should be focused on sustaining the mission. And that's what leadership is not about, protecting the institution. It's about sustaining the mission. So our question is, how do we do that? So I asked the question of the group, how effective has your congregation been at implementing the elements of its vision? And you see here almost a typical bell curve where most people said somewhat effective, but there is room for improvement. Some people felt that they've been extremely effective, and some organizations said, we haven't been very effective, or we don't have a vision. And it may be, in fact, that there isn't a concrete enough operational definition of the vision to be able to plan around it. And that's something that organizations can figure out. And I would encourage folks to really be thinking about what is our product? What is our gift given for our congregation? For many congregations, historically it was exploring spirituality, understanding God's call, engagement in ministry. Today, how do we package spirituality and the contemplative life in the way that people can experience it in their world today with the busyness of today's environment? And then how do we package, what are the ministries themselves? And I think, and this was the challenge that I threw out to the group, the challenge today is how do we make these gifts virtual? Because sisters no longer have captive audiences of the past. And I referred to an article that Stephanie Hall-Kabeloff actually wrote. She's the communications director for the Sisters of St. Joseph in Northwest Pennsylvania. She wrote an article in one of her recent magazines about a book that was written that suggested that technology may be a platform for spirituality. And I read that article and I highlighted it because folks at the conference were talking about it and said, I challenge you all to think about how do we create those virtual programs and services so that in my busy life, people ask me where I live, and I do have a house in Erie, Pennsylvania, but my answer to that question is I live on Route 79 in my car. So traveling back and forth between two offices, one in Erie, Pennsylvania, one in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and really traveling to all parts of the country for work that I do, when do you have time to stop long enough? A virtual spiritual direction product or service would be a wonderful thing for a busy person to be able to connect. And maybe the service is one where you have face-to-face meetings every so often, but not every meeting, the way virtual consulting and coaching has been done in recent years. Again, something to think about. And I also talked about sustainability being related to 4 capacities in an organization and needing to look at leadership, adaptive management, and technical competencies. Because I've found that, especially small organizations, there's a long laundry list of technical competencies that people need to have. And I've often said we need a staff of at least 18 to have a basic level of competency in the technical things that we need to have. Perhaps we should be doing a little bit more collaboration with other organizations and other congregations to get some of the technical competencies that we need so that we don't have to pay for everything or buy everything on our own in terms of helping to support our organization moving forward. So these capacities are different than the capacities that the Hilton Foundation was talking about, but they are related in some degrees because it's really hard to increase membership if you don't have good adaptive capacity, which is the ability to respond to and stimulate change in order to come up with new ways of engaging people. That's just an example. I also talk about the fact that we get stuck sometimes in our immunity to change as people. And the biggest error we often make is we try to apply technical means to solve adaptive challenges. And we don't really think about the fact that there's an immune system that operates in our bodies, much like our white blood cells, that thwart us from accomplishing self-improvement goals. Those of us who are trying to do something, we may have an improvement goal, but we often have hidden commitments and deeply ingrained assumptions that we don't even realize that are there. That subconsciously we are driven by those hidden commitments and those assumptions, and we don't think to challenge them. And when we don't challenge our assumptions about what we believe we think we know, as I said in the beginning, we will stay stuck because we're living under a set of assumptions that are no longer helpful to us. I want to talk a little bit about price, because the price of admission to religious life is different today. Historically, it was a commitment that an individual had to make. Well, today, I heard from lots of folks that this thing called student loan debt is standing in the way of many people joining religious congregations. And I told this story. My church actually has had 2 young women join a community, same community actually, in the last, I want to say 3 or 4 years. Both of them had student loan debt, and our church raised the money for those 2 women to pay off their student loan debt so that they can join that congregation. Why not have churches sponsor women to do this? You know, there's always, so many people pray for an increase in vocations, but you know, those of us who are lay people can help support that process if we know about it. And I still will, from time to time, because I'm on their mailing list, I'll send donations to that religious community in the name of those 2 women who came from my church to help support them. Why not? Okay? And it's not even a religious community that I had a personal relationship with. It's because of those women from my church, and I believe in that. So I think there's an opportunity there to approach that process in a different way and to rethink your assumptions. Also, you know, this idea of sustainability around place and promotion, historically, as I mentioned earlier, captive audiences were the distribution channels for religious orders. We had schools, we had hospitals, and we had churches. Well, today, we have different channels and different communication strategies that we have to use. We could use storytelling. We could use social media. We could use ministries. We could use programs. And creating programs that allow people to experience them without necessarily being physically in one place and time. I think there's, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a great opportunity for that. There's also a need to think about what is branding and how does that fit? You know, I had some people at the conference tell me that there are some sisters who are just very much opposed to the idea of branding because of the connotation, the violence associated with the way cattle are branded. Now, getting, you know, all of that with the words aside, if we can come up with a new word, I'm interested in any suggestions anybody has. If you can get past the word branding, it really is all of the parts of the marketing mix working together. It's your product, your price, your place, and your promotion all working together to create a lived experience of what you have to offer. It really is the integration of all internal and external experiences, communications, and messaging, and it's more than a logo. It's a lived experience of what you offer. Now, the value of the brand is that it creates meaning to customers. It personifies your idea. I was out with my daughter one day last week, and we were in line at a Starbucks. We were this was in the drive-through line. We were probably the 10th car in the drive-through line. She refused to go in. She said it's no quicker inside. And she said to me, who'd have thought we'd be paying $5 for a cup of coffee? But yet we're paying $5 for a cup of coffee because of the way Starbucks has created an experience around beverages. And it does have meaning. It's a way of delivering on the promise of quality, consistency, and confidence. And I often talk in my strategic planning presentations about we have to think about how we do things the way McDonald's does its franchises, that we have to be able to have a standardization so that if I'm going to go to get spiritual direction from one person versus another, that there's some consistency of approach even though people are different, that there is being able to deliver on that promise of quality or consistency across people and geography is important. And it also has market value. And if we think about what do successful brands have, they have authenticity. It's the real deal. They do the same thing over and over again. They can impact. There's alignment between and among them. There's internal consistency there. There's depth and there's loyalty. And don't we want all of these things for our communities as well? don't we want people to know what it means to be a Sister of St. Joseph, or what it means to be a Sister of Mercy in a particular community? We want that to know. And what is special about these brands? These brands have made it to become what is called ubiquitous brands, where the brand name has actually replaced the label on the commodity product. So Kleenex, we say, give me a Kleenex, that has replaced the word tissue. Q-tips are now give me a Q-tip, not a cotton swab. What are these brands? Well, these brands are special. Why are these brands special? Because they have no words. We know what they mean, and we know them just from the image. And those images evoke all sorts of things about what that brand means. So the questions you should be asking yourselves about branding, once you can get past the violence of the word, is what symbols, words, or phrases capture the essence of your charism? What are the gifts given? What are the products of your charism today for each target group? And how do people know what you stand for? Because all of those questions are important, and it's impossible today. One size fits all doesn't work anymore. And why I say each target group is because once upon a time, we could do marketing to the masses, and one message would generally go out to millions of people, and they would get the message. Well, or that they would buy a product. And my favorite example of how times have changed in target marketing is Tide detergent. Once upon a time, Tide detergent was powder. And actually the powder is coming back, interestingly enough. But for a long time, the powder went away, and we had these big bottles of Tide. And there was only one kind of Tide. It was in a big orange bottle. It had a cap to it. They were all the same. Now we have 15 flavors of Tide. There are 15 different kinds of Tide. There's a Tide for everything. The bottle is half the size. And we have Tide with Oxy, Tide with Febreze, Tide Free, all sorts. We have Tide with bleach, alternative. There's all sorts of Tide. And trust me, Procter & Gamble knows that every one of those different kinds of Tide appeals to a different kind of person. There are different kinds of people buying each one of those. And they recognize that one size fits all doesn't work anymore. That you've got to have a different experience for different kinds of people based on what they're interested in. And although it makes our communications and marketing process a whole lot more complicated, because now we have to have different strategies for different people, because it's going to be very different for me to speak to a 20 or 24-year-old than it is for me to speak to a 40 or a 45-year-old or a 50-year-old. The way they process information is different. The way they purchase is different. So you've got to be thinking about what are the gifts given for each of the target groups who I feel, or we feel, we are called to serve as part of our community or congregation. And I also talked about this example that, and most people in the group were able to call this out as British Petroleum. But this company, which is not a really, they really didn't do a good job of explaining this. BP actually changed their name to Beyond Petroleum and came up with this new logo, which actually, if you think about the company's name being Beyond Petroleum, it's actually kind of a creative logo, except they really didn't communicate that very well in terms of what it was attempting to represent. The other thing that you want to think about in terms of branding is that if you do your branding process well, that you are actually looking at striving in all forms of matter. Is people are trying to organize into relationships. People are seeking connections. And there is a law in actually quantum physics that talks about the law of attraction. And as we become clear about who we are and what we want, this clarity transforms us into powerful magnets so that we are actually attracted to the kinds of people that we want to attract as part of our marketing and communication strategy. And I asked folks, how well have you articulated your charism in a way that you can use in your marketing and communications messages? Now, the majority of the people in the room thought they were doing it to some degree, but they haven't necessarily translated that into a few summary words they can use, and others felt that they have done it well. And I would submit to you that there's a correlation between those who have felt that they've done it well and used those words frequently and those folks that feel like their marketing and communication strategies are tending to be more effective because of this law of attraction. How often are you operating like lighthouses, standing on the shore, attracting people with your charism and light? Or are you running up and down the beach looking for people to serve? If you really are clear about who you are and what you bring and what are your gifts as a congregation based on where you're being called, you will naturally begin to attract people. So how do you get that law of attraction to work in your favor? Be clear about who you're meant to serve. Hire people, only people who are truly aligned with that mission. Ensure that your products, your management practices, and all your organizational structures are in line with that mission. Measure how well you do it every day. And trust that money is a byproduct of staying true to that mission while being clear about what you need. I have a whole presentation that I do on how to build a case for support for investment and strategic investment philanthropy for people who are trying to raise money. How do we apply these concepts as a congregation? Discern where God is calling your congregation through your charism, and what are those gifts given, and to whom? Because different gifts are for different kinds of people. Look for ways to identify the people and organizations who share that charism and invite them to share space and resources. For those congregations who actually have a lot of real estate, you should be looking to partner with folks who share your charism and try to create some economies of scale by having more organizations either work together, cohabitate, share space. Translate the spirituality in the community of the sisters into tangible stories and experiences to engage people in your charism. And if you attract the right people, they will promote you in the charism. Engage others on the journey. Collaborate with others, with ministries, to explain what the sisters stand for and communicate the impact. One of the ways of looking at and communicating your impact is through what's called the social cause marketing model. And this was a new concept to most of the folks in the room the day I did the presentation. That is a flow chart. It explains the process of how individuals go through a series of decisions on the way to committing to do something differently. And it's been used by groups all across the country to shift societal thinking and behavior. And my favorite example of it is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And it's what Nuns on the Bus is doing without calling it that. It also explains how individuals go through a process to make a personal commitment or change, such as getting involved with the American Cancer Society or quitting smoking. It can also be used to explain the process that women go through to make a commitment to vocation or to engage with the sisters in their ministries. And here in the presentation, here's a copy of the various boxes. Pre-contemplation, contemplation, social, emotionally connected or not, people are preparing or not, they're either taking action or not, and they're either deciding to continue their behavior. And one of the keys to successful marketing communications, or just successful communications in general, is how do we communicate with and engage people at each phase of the process. That's an important consideration, not only if you're marketing vocation, but if you're just trying to get people engaged with your community. Why is that important to you? Your congregation has a social cause. So you're trying to communicate to attract others. And you have multiple ones of them. One of them is helping people to live a more spiritual life. Another is possibly getting them involved in different social justice ministries. This approach will help you to develop a plan to identify the communications and support that will deliver the desired outcome at each stage of the engagement process. I found out from working with the presentation sisters that women who were closer to a decision to enter or to join a community, the information that they needed and the support they needed at that phase of the decision process was much different than the support they needed at the beginning of a discernment process. And I really feel personally that many women today, they don't even realize that the sort of the nagging at their soul or at their heart is God calling them to do something. The basics of experiencing God in Discernment 101, people don't know what that is. We don't teach that well in the Catholic Church for young people to know and understand that. And how does it work? Define the social cause. What outcome are we trying to achieve? And it could be different with different outcomes. Look at the phases and the steps. Look at the motivators that help transition people from one to the next. Identify the education and experiences that will help people along the journey. Design those gifts. When I talk about that, there may be a different education program that works for people at the beginning of a process, or that is powerful enough to help people say, well, gee whiz, maybe I ought to think about committing my life in a different way to where God is calling me. And that may be different for young women who are in college than it is for middle-aged women who are just seeking. Here's how it looks sort of laid out by the different phases. And the question is, what do we do to communicate with and engage people at each phase of the process? The reality in today's world, that one-size-fits-all doesn't work. While we all yearn for simplicity, if we organize our thinking into the various segments, and if we customize our messages and offerings to the need of a particular group of people, we're going to be way more successful. If you take nothing away from this presentation except to say, I recognize that I have different kinds of people that need different things, and I'm going to design experiences for them based on their individual needs, and I'm going to talk to them individually or to that kind of group in a particular way, it's going to make all the difference in the world. And if you want to know how to find out what different people are thinking or what kinds of messages that they need, the best way to do that is to simply ask them. I talked in my presentation about a technique that I use. I call it the focus group of one, which is a series of questions, and I outline them, which is, how I do concept testing with people to find out how to communicate with them better. It's a technique that I would encourage you to think about. And I also think that different communities ought to think about working collaboratively on the same things in the same way so that you can start to generate some type of collective impact. And I encourage the communities that were at the event to think about, how do you communicate collaboratively? How might you work together to explain the impact that religious communities have made in the world? And what are we supporting with our communications? Who are the targets for each of those, and what are their characteristics and needs? Your plan should think through that. And you should also evaluate your outcomes and your impact in order to get the right attention and to make a case for support for what you're doing. I have an example here in the presentation about how to evaluate different connections. In some of these, like media and community events, number of Facebook friends, number of Twitter followers, number of people who signed up for the newsletter, number of people who attended a follow-up program, which is actually an outcome of a first program, the number of people we've identified as seeking, the number of people who became volunteers, the number of volunteer hours. You know, you could start to quantify that across years in your community and also think about what's the impact of those strategies? What's the return on investment that the community is getting? And I talk about return on investment because I said this is going to be the epitaph on my tombstone. The faith-based organizations have the least faith when it comes to taking the leap of faith to make a strategic investment. And I just think that that's so sad because we're so busy doing the work that we think, you know, so much of us live under, we think we can't afford it, there isn't enough money to do this. But there's lots of examples. If you make a case for investment in a particular ministry, people give. Sister Simone talked about the fact that the nuns were not going to go out on the bus without raising $200,000, and she said they had something like $225,000 in something like 10 days or something really ridiculous. And I have a priest friend who is one of the best fundraisers that I've ever seen. And it's actually at a local church. That church and that small congregation has raised over $1 million over the last 8 or 9 years to completely renovate this church because he breaks down what's needed into the various components. Like he outfitted a brand new chapel where there's 24/7 Eucharistic adoration. $80,000 for that chapel was raised in about 2 weeks because different people bought chairs, somebody bought the altar, somebody brought the other statues that were in it. You make the case for this being important, and people will give. And we don't often think about that and don't try to raise the money, don't make a case to raise the money before we try to do something. And I think there needs to be more of that. So in closing, to better market your charism, think about your strategic thinking in alignment with your calling, charism, and communication strategy. Determine the gifts of your charism and to whom they are and should be given. Identify the capacities that your congregation needs in order to better organize. Offer and communicate those gifts to the target audiences and create connections and engagement. And I offer to you the assessment tool so that you can actually look through and create the ability to target where you might be stuck in your community and try to figure out how to get to the next step. I encourage you to measure and evaluate the outcomes and impact of your ministries, including the economic impact of those ministries, and not just if there was somebody else doing the stuff. One of the comments that the woman from the Conrad Hilton Foundation made about Mr. Hilton, he said he wanted to invest in the sisters because he knew he'd get 1,000 to 1 return on that dollar. That the sisters could take $1 and make 1,000 out of it, which was really an important return on investment thinking, which is why he created that endowment to continue to help the sisters. Consider collaboration with other congregations, locally, regionally, and nationally, in telling the story of outcomes and impacts, and even more importantly, the compelling needs that require additional investment, to invite others to share in the spiritual journey, the charism, and the ministries. Because we all know the more we live the contemplative life, the more we recognize that it's all about relationship with others and relationship with God and how that transforms us individually, we actually serve more as a result of that. And then tailor specific messages to individual needs, and you'll be able to engage folks in that process. And then in closing, I say never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world, because indeed it's the only thing that ever has. So with that, I invite any questions that you have. Any questions that anyone has? I'm going to stop the recording, and thank you for participating in the webinar today. And if anyone has...
Thank you. Please stand by.